Howdy folks, welcome to the garage. This is our first project. This is a 2013 Ford Fusion. As it sits, it is a running and driving EcoBoost, but we have some other plans for it. One of these 5.3s over on the wall will be calling this car home, along with this 4L80E, as well as the rear end out of an S550 Mustang. The Fusion is in a little bit of rough shape. Got some cosmetic stuff on the outside, and the interior is quite filthy. So, first things first, we're going to get her cleaned up. This was an auction car, so obviously it has some problems. One of them being the engine doesn't run super well and smokes a lot. If I had to guess, it would be that the turbo seals went bad, so it's just dumping oil and coolant into the exhaust. The oil does look okay, so I think the engine itself is fine. So before we pull the engine out, I'm going to do maybe an engine flush, get the oil out of there, pull the turbo, and see if the car runs with new oil and without the turbo. Because if it does, then we have a good running 2-liter engine for our next project. One other thing I wanted to mention before we start tearing into the car is the overall goal for the project. So not only do we want to make this a rear-wheel drive V8 Fusion, we also want to keep most of the stock interior. So we're going to keep the gauges. We're going to do our best to make those fully functional with the new ECU. All of the radio control and cruise control will ideally all still work. And last but not least, we're going to get the paddle shifters to work with the new 4L80E. All right, I've pulled the plugs, and they do look pretty used up. You can see a divot forming on the ground strap there, and they're pretty coated in soot as well. So obviously there's a lot of unburnt fuel. I doubt that this has everything to do with the smoke in the exhaust, because it was pretty blue. So I'm pretty sure we're burning some oil as well. But this probably is a decent factor in it not running very well. So I'll probably throw some new plugs in, see how it runs, and we'll go from there. Well, unfortunately, it wasn't as simple as just changing spark plugs. Try to give a little chance there, but no worries. We're not super interested in this motor, so I guess we'll get started ripping it out. So before we can actually pull the engine out of the Fusion, we have to look around on the CAN bus and find the messages we need for the stock dash, communicating with the fuel system, and controlling the transmission with the paddle shifters. So that, unfortunately, just looks like a lot of this. So I'll spare you those details, and I'll take you along on some of the more interesting parts. So for essentially every message that I'm interested in, all I'm doing is watching the CAN bus while the gauge that I'm interested in changes value. So for instance, to get the messages that control the tachometer, I can simply just rev the engine and watch the CAN bus to see if any of the messages change at a similar rate to the tachometer. I'll try to show you what I'm getting at here. Just above this hose here with the green clip on it, should be able to see right through there. There's a silver or a gray plug with the yellow wires. I'm trying to get that unplugged. Alrighty, I finally got that sensor unplugged, and now we can see that the engine coolant temperature is down at negative 40 degrees. So we found our sensor. Now we have to figure out how we want to change the temp in order to catch that change on the actual CAN system so that we can mimic that signal. This is the connection that goes to the ECM. So the way these sensors work is that they output a voltage that differs with temperature. So usually the voltage is lower when the engine is warm, and the voltage is higher when the engine is cold. So I put these jumpers into the connector, and I've got them connected to these leads. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a voltage across these leads and see if that changes the temperature reading. So I've got the settings opened up on the phone, or rather the readout from the OBD2 scanner. I have this AA battery here, which is dead, or at least close to dead. So it reads about 1.1 volts. Ideally, this will hopefully protect the ECU if I'm wrong about this and this doesn't work. But if this does work, we should see that negative 40 change to a more appropriate value. Look at that. All right, it changed to 150.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So basically, now we can use this battery and these jumpers and just keep changing the temperature, and we can use that to basically figure out what CAN messages are controlling the temperature gauge on the dash, and then we can fake those messages and send them whenever we want. All right, we got the temperature sensor figured out. I was able to map it to the CAN message that we need and send it to the dash. So now we can see the needle on the dash is moving. It even brings up the overcoolant temperature warning when we hit max. So that's looking great. So I actually ended up going a different way to get the coolant temperature sensor working. The battery method did work. It did change the sensor both just via the CAN bus as well as on the dash, but it was really hard to connect and disconnect this and try to catch that message. So I went and got my bench power supply, and we can just vary the voltage as much as we want between 0.2 and 1.5, which is the sensor's range. And varying that and paying attention to the messages, we were able to catch which message was controlling the coolant needle. All right, I went through the trouble of breaking these bolts off to get the fuel tank dropped. The two rear ones were rusted out pretty bad. Two front ones came out, but back one's broke. Not a big deal. The tank has to come out anyway. It'll get in the way of the drive shaft. But after that, I found the harness for the fuel system here. It was tucked up underneath here. The other end is right there. And I was able to look up a diagram and find which of those goes to the dash. It looks like the fuel level sensor is not actually on the CAN bus. So I just hooked up my multimeter to it, and basically there was a saved value because I had unplugged this harness expecting the fuel gauge to drop to 0, but it didn't. But I hooked up the multimeter, and it was showing a voltage, so when I grounded these together, just touched them together, the fuel gauge dropped to 0. So I should be able to put a voltage on this and manipulate the fuel gauge. All right, my assumption about how the fuel gauge worked was totally wrong. You can see right now, it's showing about a quarter tank. And then if we go back, we can see that all I had to do was put a 100 ohm resistor across the two fuel gauge lines. So the fuel gauge is just simply a variable resistor. So all we have to do is give it the resistance it expects, and it will work just fine. So basically what that means is I'm probably just going to use this fuel sending unit in the new tank that we build, since we have to build a new tank to accommodate the drive shaft. And now I'm just going to pull this resistor, and we can see that the gauge will drop to 0. All right, so I've been playing with this for a little bit, and I finally figured out how to get the dash to tell us what gear we're in just arbitrarily. So the ECM is unplugged. The dash is currently getting no signal as to what gear we're in. But if I send this CAN message, it now shows that we are in park. Have you ever wanted to rev your car to red line with zero consequences? Well, this is one way to do it. All right, so now we're going to look for the speedometer messages coming from the ECM. So in order to do that, we've got the car picked up off the ground so that we can spin the front tires without having to go drive it. Another way to find the messages we need is to visualize the changes in the values of the messages. For example, this is a graph of the 8 bytes of the message that controls the RPM needle on the dash. The 4th and 5th bytes contain the RPM data, so if our RPM values go from 0 to 1,000, think of the 4th byte as containing these values, and the 5th byte contains these values. So the 5th byte has very fine control over the RPM needle, and changing the 4th byte would change the RPM value drastically. And this is a graph of the speedometer message. So in this case, the 7th and 8th bytes control the speedometer needle on the dash in similar fashion to the RPM needle. The 7th byte controls the large steps, and the 8th byte controls the fine steps. And finally, we have the message that contains wheel speed data. So the 1st and 2nd bytes here contain the wheel speed data for the front left tire. The 3rd and 4th bytes contain wheel speed data for the front right tire, and the other 2 tires, if they were spinning, would also have data in this message. But of course they're not spinning, so we don't get any of that data. Now, the last thing I wanted to figure out was the paddle shifters. They are not on the CAN bus. I did have to look up a wiring diagram. Unfortunately, I don't think I can show it because I did have to pay an all-data subscription to get the wiring diagram. However, I was able to figure out which wires control the paddle shifters, and I have them hooked up. So now all we'll have to do is hook these up to the Arduino, and this will send the controls to the 4L80E. All right, it looks like we're getting really close to being able to run this without the ECM plugged in. All it takes is these few CAN messages. I'll show you these better off this screen, but we can see now that sending those CAN messages and turning the car on, all of our warning lights go away. It just warns us about the open doors and such. But otherwise, it says that we are ready to go. Well, that should be everything we need to get the stock dash working with the new engine and the new ECU. So in the next video, we will be getting this engine running, and we'll be mocking it up in the Fusion. If you're interested in any of the full messages that I am sending to make the stock dash happy, or the code I used, such as the code to generate the graphs to visualize the CAN messages, I'll put that all in my GitHub and link that in the description. You can also support this channel on Patreon. Of course, all of this is optional. These projects will continue one way or another. The support will just make things go faster or support bigger projects in the future. So, thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.